Now we're going to turn it over to Stephanie Fernhaber and the panel on religion and social entrepreneurship.
Thank you, Brett. And what a transition. I don't know. I was listening to the last of that conversation and really great discussion. And my mind is kind of going on, what are the implications. So thank you, Robert and everyone for that good conversation. We're going to be shifting gears a little bit, although my guess is that there will be some overlap. We are going to be talking about social entrepreneurship and religion. So looking at those kind of overlaps, although we have a great set of panelists here. And I think we're each going to offer a little bit of a different perspective. So I'm going to start out with Reg Tucker. He's first up. And the question that we have for you, Reg, is how do you see various mindsets at play in determining entrepreneurial responses to poverty? And kind of more specifically, what role does theological anthropology play in shaping whether someone responds entrepreneurially to poverty or not? So I'm going to turn over to you. We're going to have about 5 or 6 minutes for each of us, and then we'll have some time for questions from the audience at the end. So go ahead, Reg.
Great. Thank you for having me, and thanks, Brett, for inviting me to be a part of this. I don't know if I'll take 5 minutes to answer this question. So there's just overall when it comes to faith and entrepreneurship, it's probably more me search for me whenever I study this. I think I'm pretty embedded in some very intense religious communities where when I've lived in various states. Um, uh, I might, I guess, tackle the second question first, in terms of theological, like anthropology. I guess defining that would be sort of like how how do we understand humanity if we look at it through uh, humanity's relationship or the human relationship to God as God has created us. I think that's an interesting starting point. I think that may cause us to look at, I guess, sacred texts more to explain how we approach poverty. So I don't have any scholarship on this topic. So again, this is more maybe just observation, but I think so outside of even the Christian faith, I think when we look at how other religions may speak of poverty or write of poverty in their sacred texts, for sure, in the Old Testament and the New Testament, I think it gives us maybe a prescriptive way to look at poverty. So we may venture for others for them to come out of poverty. Um, but that's, of course, sort of easy to read and do. And I think there's a number of entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs who are doing this to help people come out of poverty. A recent phenomenon I've seen, and these are not scholars, is using faith, um, I guess, as a mechanism to see people differently. So instead of helping people come out of poverty, there are active people who are trying to help people get poverty to come out of them, right? So this is kind of answering the first question. Um, so using poverty to change people's mindsets, right? And this can go a number of ways if I'm tracking correctly with the question. Um, there's phrases or there's verses like you'll always have the poor with you. So should we try to change that, or should we be trying to get poverty to come out of them, right? Like lifting people out of poverty or lifting poverty out of people. Um, that's a very difficult question I see in practice. I did some boot camps with Mike Morris, and I imagine many people on here have heard of Mike Morris or worked with Mike Morris, and that was an interesting experience doing boot camps, doing entrepreneurship boot camps in impoverished communities. Um, Nothing about it was faith-based, although many of the people were of a particular faith. Um, they weren't necessarily in poverty, but it can be argued they thought with a poverty mindset. And again, that can probably be debated as well. What is a poverty mindset? There's all types of mindsets, but I think what I'm seeing more in practice is people are trying to lift poverty out of people, and that may be more difficult, to be honest. I don't know if I'm even making sense, but this is what I'm seeing in practice. The entrepreneurs in Oklahoma, the entrepreneurs I saw in Baton Rouge or New Orleans or different parts of North Carolina. This seems to be what's going on. Tackling people's mindsets more so than using a mindset to get people out of poverty. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so just to clarify, right, I'm just really curious about this. I'm just not as familiar. So when you're saying lifting poverty out of people, it's through tackling their mindset, right? Is
Yes,
that
yes. Yeah, I mean, when you consider, I guess poverty, like a poverty mindset would be, um, I want to start a business, and what's the easiest business to start to get out of poverty? Well, it's probably some type of commodity with low margins, right? So very low margins, you're not going to make much profit. Competition is going to be crazy. And this commodity will then become a commodity trap. And this is just some of the work I've done with Mike recently, but you actually will go from one type of poverty to another, right? So we might celebrate entrepreneurship as an emancipation tool, but really, and I think Alvarez and Barney have like a 2014 paper where they kind of talk about entrepreneurship sometimes is just bringing people from one type of poverty to another, which is actually very dangerous, right? If we're sort of celebrating entrepreneurship as a tool, but it may not be helping people as much as we think. And there are certainly cases where it does help and people may come out of poverty, but um, I think when some people have a mindset change, if I can say that, they may look to venture in a different way with a different product, or they may not venture at all. They may just get a better job or a job, right? And I've seen entrepreneurs who've come through the boot camp who actually had a commodity style business, and in doing so realized entrepreneurship maybe was not for them, but now they are a much better employee or much better for the workforce, right? And they're able to get a job that covers and pays all the bills. So um, I think this is sort of what I was speaking to.
Well, thank you. That's a great way to kind of kick off this discussion. And I'm up next because I'm participating on this panel, and I think what you had just said, Reg, might have some implications for what I'm going to talk about. The question pointed at myself was more around the research I've been conducting lately on how individuals navigate entrepreneurship after incarceration, and more specifically, how does faith shape the entrepreneurial efforts of marginalized individuals, particularly those who have been previously incarcerated, and their commitment to social impact. And for those of you that are less familiar with this topic, the U.S. Relies heavily on imprisonment as part of its criminal justice system and is one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. There are nearly 2 million individuals currently behind bars. And now, as individuals finish serving their time and are released back into society, many turn to entrepreneurship. And in fact, and again, Reg, I don't know if this is a good thing or a bad thing, but according to the U.S. Small Business Administration, if you have a felony, you're 45% more likely to start a business than individuals without a criminal record. And for many, this is a necessity, given that businesses many times will not hire someone with a criminal record, and it's completely legal to do so. Yet the irony is that the entrepreneurial journey is much more difficult than most traditional entrepreneurs if you consider factors such as stigma, being left behind, 10 years on technology, or needing to figure out where to live, where to stay, mending broken relationships, and all this at the same time as you're kind of starting your venture. So I have partnered with Fiona Robinson out of Mount Royal University, and we've been exploring the entrepreneurial journey of those individuals following being released from prison. Taken a qualitative approach and have been conducting interviews. And while there's so much I could share here, I think for the purpose of this panel, I'll highlight briefly a few ways in which faith emerged during these conversations. That was not our intent. We're not studying religion, and even our research right now hasn't really highlighted it that much. but it came up in some unexpected ways, which raised additional questions for me. So I think I'll highlight those. And again, I'm not posing the answers, but just kind of what was, oh, that's surprising. I didn't expect it there. I think first, and this might be the one that's perhaps most obvious, but individuals, when they are in prison, many turn to a deeper faith as a way to get them through a harder, this difficult season, right? When this difficult time when they have to serve and not in the greatest of places. So it turns to build some kind of foundation or an armor, right, to help them get through it, and as they get out. And so the question that this poses for me is, right, does religion play a greater role for marginalized individuals, and those are more privileged, right? Is it more central in the entrepreneurial process? Secondly, what we observed in talking with these individuals was that there were exposure in prison to many different types of faith. And I think for most of us in society, we are exposed to those that are in whatever religion or faith community that we are closest to. So religious groups tend to clump together, and there's less exposure or understanding of those who are different. But what was shared with us by these individuals that had served a significant amount of time is that you have to find ways to get along and to understand and to live with those that are very different for you. So they had so much more exposure to every single type of faith than I could even think of. So again, that raises some questions for me, right? Like, I don't know if it's marginalization in general or these kind of experiences. How does that kind of forced diversity? Is there a benefit to that, right? Because they thought it did help them when they were outside and they had to get along with people, in their business or in the world that, well, nothing's, that different or radical for me. Third, I think what we found is when individuals were released and trying to figure out how to live in society again, while trying to make a living through their business, it's really easy to spiral downward. There's a very high recidivism rate as well in the United States, where individuals then, are feeling hopeless, they commit a crime, and then they go back into the system. So there's this need to cultivate hope. And one of the things, again, we weren't looking for it, but when we were looking at how do individuals cultivate hope, some of that is internally, but there's also an external component with these kind of whatever support communities that they find. Now, it differed for most everyone, but for several of them, they turned to religion, this kind of religious community. So again, what is religion's role in creating hope, right? What role does that have? And then the last one that I'll share with you, which was both kind of unexpected and inspiring, was this intention by most everyone we talked to, almost every entrepreneur, was this intention to give back and to do something positive in the world. Two of them had actually started nonprofits along with their for-profit businesses, and many of the others had integrated social impact into their business. And I'll give you a brief example. There, we had an individual that was a barber, so he was had his own barbershop kind of place where he was cutting hair. And he shared that he always would always give kids with good grades and these different scenarios, he'd give them a free haircut. And he was a pretty fancy, like he could do the really kind of cool haircuts for boys and stuff, or individuals with short hair. And, as we're talking, I said, well, why do you do that? And he said, well, it's my way of kind of making amends because I impacted so many of their parents in a negative way when I was working with, dealing with drugs and different things that they had kids, right? So I had such a negative impact. So it was a way almost of making amends. And again, this was repeatedly, coming up. Several of them have kind of nonprofits that are kind of helping individuals that are getting incarcerated as youth, right? Just these really active notions. And so I think that for me, again, this raised the question of when we think about motivations when it comes to social entrepreneurship and those that are doing these, these are these unjust equilibriums that people feel motivated and passionate to address. But I wonder if we overlook that sometimes that this motivation comes for they created those unjust equilibriums, right? And it's a way of kind of reconciling them. And I don't really know where the faith or religion comes in there, but to me, I think from many different religious perspectives that could be part of that process. So those are just a few kind of, I guess, rumblings inside my head, kind of connecting all this. And so I look forward to kind of hearing what else everyone has to say. So next up on our panel, we're going to turn to Saulo Barbosa. And my question for you, or that we've created, is how does faith shape entrepreneurial cognition around social ventures, particularly in terms of identifying desirability of opportunities and assessment of outcomes? And also, what are we missing if we study social entrepreneurship without a faith lens? So curious as to what you have to say here.
Thank you, Stephanie. Thank you for the questions, and very happy to be here as well. Thank you, Brett. Thank you, everyone. Wonderful conversation so far. So let me try to start by answering the first one. I think it's an open question. I think we haven't stopped answering that. I wanted to give a baseline answer and maybe point to directions and then go to the second question. Baseline answer is that in general, what we see is empirical evidence that people who have faith are more optimistic, right? And that's in general, and that's also what we found with entrepreneurs. We found that entrepreneurs that actually integrate their religious beliefs within their ventures, they tend to evaluate new opportunities more favorably, more optimistically than entrepreneurs who do not have or who do not integrate those beliefs. So I would say that, and there is a lot of empirical research in social sciences, but also in psychology, neurosciences, that shows different potential mechanisms for what that happens, right? And why people are more optimistic about their future in general, on average, when they have religious beliefs. Some of these mechanisms go through the beliefs themselves, some of the mechanisms go through the practices, and basically prayer, meditation, even mindfulness, and all these more meditative practices, they tend to generate in the brain dopamine and other substances that make us happy, that make us more positive. At the same time, what I find very interesting is that doing something for others, helping other people, generates also these things in our brains, right? So helping others, there is research on that helping others actually generates dopamine in your brain. So we have research that's starting to show a bit of the mechanisms of why people tend to be more favorable when evaluating opportunities. I think social entrepreneurship is a field where we're missing a lot. I'll come to the second question soon, but we're missing a lot if you don't get this faithfulness there. I would say that in terms of cognition, I think we need to explore more these mechanisms. I think there are many questions about the boundary conditions for these findings, right? There is a huge heterogeneity of religions. We mentioned before, the other panels, the dark side of religion, and that might affect as well. Religion can be empowering, but we also know that it can be fatalistic. It can have maybe collateral effects. Jeff mentioned also this morning in terms of network. What if you're out of the network, of the religious network? So there are many things that I think we still have to explore for that. Now, there are a few things I wanted to share and thoughts about the second question, about what are we missing if we do not have this faith lens in social entrepreneurship. And when I got this question, the first thing that came to my mind was the title of a paper that Kelly Shaver and Scott published back in 1991. And basically, the title was Person, Process, and Choice, Psychology of Entrepreneurship. And I think we're missing those things if we do not have a faith lens in entrepreneurship. I think we're missing the person. You talked about motivation. We talked about cognition. Religion has a deep effect in the cognitive. Norris Kruger talks about these deep cognitive structures, right? And I think that's where you situate deep religious beliefs. So if you're not looking at that, you're missing part of what makes a person. Talked about motivation, and I think also this relationship with God that is formative of what a person is and why they're doing what they're doing. Right? We're missing the process because religious networks play a lot of, we know that plays a role in the entrepreneurial process. We're missing the process of how they gather resources using religious networks to get there. We're missing the process of why they do and how they actually go about doing their social action. If we just evacuate the religion aspect of it. In most, because we know social entrepreneurs often talk about calling, about serving and self-sacrifice and for others, concern for others, which is a common trait across most religions, actually. I think we're also missing the context because every time we're in the field doing research, there is a historical background there. And I remember when we were in Argentina many years ago, that's a paper we published in JDV, we were looking at an NGO, but when you start digging deeper in the story of the NGO, it was actually founded by a priest in the 70s. I started with the church, started with the Catholic Church in Latin America that made a choice in that period to go and live with the poor. Right? And if you miss that, you basically miss the context, right? And that's super important to better understand social entrepreneurship. And I think finally, and that I think that the notion of choice connects those things. I think we are missing also if we do not think about faith or integrate that into the things we study when study social entrepreneurship, we are also missing a great opportunity to better understand why people choose to do what they're doing, right? And I thought a lot in terms of what Jeff was telling, that if you think about religion, you're inviting death in a way to your thought process, right? And that means you're basically realizing that you are mortal. And when you put that in perspective, then you can actually ask, okay, what's then worth doing, right? Since I'm going to die someday, right? And I think that's a very, very fundamental question we need to ask. And social entrepreneurs, generally, they do ask that question. And they might even tell you, well, I didn't have a choice. That was the only choice, given that perspective. So I'll stop there.
That's good. That's good. Context, calling, so much, right? So thank you. We're going to shift a little bit to Jessica Jones. Jessica, our question for you is, how does entrepreneur explicitness about their faith commitments affect their perception among angel investors? And what might this mean for the study of entrepreneurship and social entrepreneurship, or, even impact investing?
Awesome. Thank you, Stephanie, and thanks to the panelists, and also for those of you that are still listening in a few hours in. I've learned as a faculty member that teaches right before lunch that this is like, wake up. So I've got my few minutes here before we all break, but I'm super invigorated by this conversation, and I think I'll broaden the scope here because the topic is on faith and social entrepreneurship with just this broad definition in scouring the internet and research of what we mean by faith-based social enterprises. And to kind of condense that definition, I was seeing these words of things that are akin to like businesses rooted in spiritual values that drive their mission, operations, and impact. And although not every faith-based social enterprise might be overtly or explicitly religious in how it's described or narrated or branded, their principles often stem from faith traditions, perhaps like with compassion, justice, or stewardship. And so that suggests that, faith-based social enterprises can be expressed in a variety of ways. And sometimes that's not just up to the founder, but also the audience in terms of who its stakeholders are, more broadly also have an ability to kind of help shape what that explicitness is. Everybody has an opinion of what Chick-fil-A and Hobby Lobby are to some extent, right? And so when we think about faith-based social enterprises, that could be on the extreme version of incredibly embedded and at its root of existence is tenets of faith. Faith aligned, where perhaps the reason for the venture is aligned with some faith-based principles, or perhaps faith influenced. And I think one of the markers of that is how overt it is. So two examples in the entrepreneurship world might be an organization called Kaleo Labs, where in its core mission, how they describe what they do is to focus on what they call redemptive entrepreneurship, where they create a culture that honors God. And so that's very explicit. On the other hand, some people would, if we look at like the first social enterprise in Grameen Bank, some might think, although it's secular in nature and overtly, it is very informed through Islamic principles. And so the extent to which we talk about faith-based social enterprises not only has something to do with the motivations of the individual, but also how much it's expressed. And I think that has important implications for not just what we study and how we describe faith and social entrepreneurship, but then also what does that mean theoretically for things like cultural entrepreneurship, institutional theory, legitimacy, et cetera. I had the experience to do one study, and it was an experiment where, because of this complexity, you could imagine that it's not only difficult to study this on behalf of the founder, but then also how other people view that. So investors, for example. And Ashley Roccapriori was a panelist earlier who spoke about this study. And what was interesting to us is that it's not just also about like this level of explicitness, but what was unique too is not just somebody's faith and religion are very different constructs as well. So my personal belief, as well as the religious practices I enact. And so I think those are two important things to also pay attention to as we think about ourselves as scholars and what we mean by faith-based, faith-informed, et cetera. So taking all this complexity together, we did do an experiment that looked at how investors react to entrepreneurs when they describe their mission as faith and or social. And what we realized is that in an experiment, we actually had to control out the social piece to really understand the faith piece. What that means, although it's a limitation to that particular study, I found myself just kind of scratching my head a little bit of what does that really mean if we were to think about the dimensions of both faith and social, both as it pertains to the founder, in terms of it being informed, but then also in terms of the audiences and how they receive that. Another part of that study that we had to limit was the homogeneity of both the founder and the venture in terms of their same religion. So a few people have talked about this as well, but you could imagine that somebody who is Christian who talks to somebody else who has a different practice of faith, perhaps they have a commonality, but maybe because of like what Stephanie said, we like to be in our similar religious groups. So what does that mean when we are speaking about our own faith to somebody that's not of our own faith? And I think that's an important aspect to also consider as it pertains to both social faith-based enterprises and faith-based enterprises. I could say a lot more here, and I'm clearly passionate about this, but I think what I'd like to at least provoke for the following discussion and leave a little some room for Scott and the others is that in a lot of this, and even that definition that I started with, we are making a big assumption that faith is the antecedent and informs both the social aspects and the venturing process. But I'm curious if we can better understand and start to think about this domain of faith and entrepreneurship and social is what do we really get wrong when we assume that faith is that true antecedent? And what would we maybe understand or unpack a bit more if we kind of reverse the arrow? And in the sense of, for example, like Kaleo Labs, I've seen that exists to help people who are entrepreneurs inform their faith journey. And so in some ways, like venturing could actually be the catalyst to somebody's faith or to somebody's spiritual practice. And so I'm curious to others to think about how we might provoke some new interesting research around that. The second observation and last thing I'll say is in considering this research, I've done a lot of work in rural areas of Guatemala, and most recently I was on a field trip, and we started to unpack that looking at the venture and looking at the entrepreneur actually isolates a lot of the temporality. And we've talked a little bit about time and the importance of history and story. But when we think about temporality and as it pertains to faith and social entrepreneurship, oftentimes we look at faith and practice as an evolving process. We use the words journey, and we use like how we grew, etc. And so I think sometimes if we treat it as just an isolated variable, that perhaps omits a really rich opportunity to think about temporality as it pertains not just to the particular person or the particular venture, but we've talked about communities and the evolution of such communities and some broader aspects. I know that's harder, especially for a young faculty member to do. Can't go out and do 10 years of data collection, but I think that's a really important aspect for how we start to consider faith and social entrepreneurship together. So with that, I'll stop and thank you again.
Thanks, Jessica. Definitely some good questions and different ways for us to think. Scott, we're up to you. How do agency and affect shape performance and impact in social entrepreneurship? And how can the incorporation of a faith and entrepreneurship approach complement existing research, especially on entrepreneurial affect? What do you think?
Yeah, thanks, Stephanie. Thanks to the panelists and Brett and everybody else who brought me here today. It was interesting as I was listening to my colleagues speak, a lot of what they talked about is actually sort of similar to some of the thoughts I put together to answer this question. So just to start with Reg and Stephanie, they both talked about, you know, one of the things that we've looked at before when we think about agency, right? And in terms of an entrepreneur's capacity to act or not to act, a lot of what drives that is crisis. And Reg talked about poverty. Stephanie talked about incarceration, which are both two forms of crisis that certainly can motivate entrepreneurial agency. And what we've seen through some of the work that we've done is that these forms of crisis, which typically kind of frustrate action, in many cases, you know, in entrepreneurial cases, actually promotes action. You know, as I think it was Albert Einstein that said, in the midst of every crisis lies great opportunity. And we saw that. Stephanie had talked about some of the formerly incarcerated individuals had gone on to actually engage in venturing. And to the extent that venturing facilitates the sort of reintroduction into society of formerly incarcerated people, which we see reduces recidivism rates, you know, that's a way to respond to the crisis in ways that actually generate a lot of positive social impact and ideally address the crisis at, you know, and sort of limit that crisis going forward. So we see some of that. We've seen work on the construction of entrepreneurial ecosystems after post-war, in post-war conflict zones, responding to climate change, and a lot of the crises that we see that are either sort of acute or in enduring forms really stimulate action in ways that generate quite a bit of social impact, and in a perfect world would actually reduce the impact of that crisis going forward. So that's the agency piece. And in terms of the affect piece, again, a lot of my colleagues just today had spoken about that. You know, Stephanie talked a little bit about issues of commitment and hope. Saulo talked about optimism and other forms of positive affect. And I think those are the things that I've seen in some of the work I've done in the affect space where, you know, affect is an interesting thing. We typically see two ways in which affect can relate to entrepreneurship in general and social entrepreneurship in particular. And they somewhat align with some of the comments that Jess was making about kind of how that sort of faith social distinction, right? Jess mentioned that investors typically react to expressions of faith by entrepreneurs in their pitches. And we see the same thing with positive forms of affect, right? So the more passionate or compassionate the entrepreneur is in those contexts, investors seem to react positively to those things. We also see more positively affective entrepreneurs more likely to engage in social entrepreneurship. So their intention to engage in that form of entrepreneurship in particular is high. And then the last piece we see is that typically when entrepreneurs engage in social entrepreneurial behaviors or identify opportunities to create social value, those things positively influence their affective states. So, so there's sort of this, Jess talked about sort of reversing the arrow. So we do see that arrow kind of working in two directions where affect can influence social entrepreneurship, but in turn, social entrepreneurship can also influence the affect of the entrepreneur. So all that's sort of taken as a baseline. I think we see opportunities for faith and religion to complement some of this work. And I think there's a few ways that it can happen. I think there's like a who, a why, and a how dimension. I think on the who dimension, we've heard this morning, and I'm sure we'll hear this afternoon, about specific cases in which faith-based entrepreneurs or people of faith in general engage in these types of actions. So I think faith and religion can provide a nice contextual variable for us to think of in terms of, who are the people that are really generating this impact, and what is it about them that seems to link up? And I think this gets at Jess's last point, that seems to align, or in some cases not align, with social entrepreneurship. And I want to highlight too that, we need to be a little bit careful that we don't make the assumption that all things social are faith-based and all things faith-based are social, right? Because we see that there's a correlation, but it's not perfect, right? So we know that there are some faith-based organizations where that faith is not necessarily what we might all be thinking of when we typically think about faith, and those, so we want to just be a little bit careful on that. But I do think that this variable can provide us with a nice way to think contextually about who are these individuals and ventures that are creating this value for society. From a why perspective, I think in many cases, and some of Reg's comments I think line up with this, I think it can help explain some of the mechanisms behind why people seek to do these things, right? Like, why is it that I'm sort of driven to create some value for society? And I think faith and religion could help us make sense of that. And then lastly, I think from a how perspective, I think that the faith and religion can provide us with a way to understand some of the moderating effects between social venturing and affect. So we would expect that relationship, let's say, between like compassion and intention might be stronger for certain people than others, right? And perhaps faith is a way that sort of magnifies that relationship under certain conditions. So I see a lot of relationships here between affect and faith and social entrepreneurship, but they're all fundamentally different constructs. And I think by playing with those three constructs in different ways and understanding how those influence the agency of the individuals that are creating value in society, I think there's quite a bit of opportunity for new and exciting research. So thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Scott, and for going last, but also for kind of making those kind of connections to the earlier talks, right? Like we can kind of see how they're a little bit interconnected and raising some interesting points. We have just a couple minutes left, and I have a few questions that have been put in the chat. So maybe we'll see if we can get through at least one of them. So this question is, the question is about the recent criticisms on social entrepreneurship being an element of neoliberalism as a way of using the social aspect of business for economic gains. So how does faith shift this in practice? How does the moral, spiritual side of social entrepreneurship intervene the neoliberal tendency? So anyone can tackle this. And I was thinking of you, Jessica, originally, just because I was thinking of, the touting it, whether we call it religious or not, but anyone can kind of speak in on that question.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a great question to ask. And it's really clear that there is, just like in social entrepreneurship, there might be some ways to mitigate or meet the rubber where we kind of talk about it in terms of what is true impact. I think in our study with investors, what was interesting, at least in this faith element, is that when people disclosed faith on an initial kind of pitch, it serves as a double-edged sword. So you can say it, but then there's more scrutiny as to whether or not, if you're actually going to say it, like where are you going to do it? And so investors are reacted in such a way where they were wanting to see more of that rather than just suggest that that's what they're doing. And so I think there's a lot of room to think about how we can explore studies where it's just more than surface level, as it pertains to that. And then also thinking about dimensions of faith and social high-low and what that might look like as well. I think that's super interesting.
Well, thanks, Jessica. I think Brett and Corey, I think we're at time, right? I mean, we have more questions, but we'll have to maybe save those for another time. But I guess thank you everyone that's here on the panel. You've given me a lot of food for thought today and building on it. So thank you also for hosting us with the conference, Brett. I'll hand it over to you.
Yeah, thanks to all of you. Stephanie, thank you for moderating the panel. Reg, Saulo, Jess, and Scott, thank you for coming and being a part of this. It seems to be one of the topics that no matter what we want to talk about, it migrates in this direction. And this seems to continue to be a super ripe area for lots of research.